Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, because today you're not just watching an episode, you're about to confront one of the heaviest decisions in human history. August 1945. The world stands on the edge of emotional, physical, and moral collapse. Yet one question has echoed through decades, fueling intense debates and never losing its impact. Why did the United States decide to use atomic bombs against Japan? Before jumping to quick answers or rushed judgments, there is something crucial you need to understand. You cannot look at this moment through modern eyes. To truly grasp this decision, you must go back in time, feel the weight of the war, and see the world exactly as it was in that moment. In 1945, the planet was exhausted. This wasn't just a war, it was a global breakdown. Entire cities in Europe had been reduced to rubble. Nations were economically shattered, politically unstable, and socially devastated. Millions were dead, not only soldiers on battlefields, but civilians caught in bombings, massacres, starvation, and disease. It was nearly impossible to find someone untouched by loss. Families had been torn apart, entire generations scarred by irreversible trauma. The dominant feeling across the world was not victory or pride. It was fatigue, grief, and an overwhelming urgency to rebuild. And yet, despite all of this devastation, the war was not over. While Europe slowly began to rise from its ruins, on the other side of the world, the conflict continued with brutal intensity. The Pacific theater was different, and in many ways, even more violent. Since the early expansion of Japan, especially with the invasion of China in the 1930s, the war had already left behind a massive trail of destruction. Millions of Chinese civilians had died over the years, victims of massacres or the indirect consequences of war, such as famine and disease. And by 1945, that reality had not changed. At the same time, American forces advanced island by island, in a campaign that was long, exhausting, and extremely bloody. Every new victory came at an incredibly high human cost. One of the main reasons for this was the Japanese way of fighting. It was fundamentally different from what Allied forces had faced in Europe. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. Instead, they fought until the very last moment possible. And when defeat became inevitable, many chose suicide or desperate final attacks against the enemy. This mindset wasn't just military. It was deeply rooted in cultural values tied to honor, duty, and absolute devotion to the emperor, who was seen as a near-divine figure. In this context, surrender was not just losing a battle. It meant losing honor, identity, and personal worth. This belief transformed battles into near-total annihilation scenarios. Places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became symbols of this brutality. In each of these battles, the same pattern repeated itself. Extreme resistance, very few prisoners, and staggering death tolls. But it was in Okinawa where this reality reached an even more shocking level. The battle, which began in April 1945, marked the first time enemy forces landed on Japanese soil. The psychological impact was enormous. For the defenders, this was no longer just another battle. It was the defense of their homeland considered sacred. What followed was intense, relentless, and devastating. Hundreds of thousands of people were involved, including not only soldiers, but civilians who were mobilized into combat, often with minimal training and improvised weapons. The result was nothing short of a massacre. The vast majority of Japanese fighters died. Very few were captured alive. Many chose death over surrender. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was what happened to the civilian population. Facing imminent defeat, thousands of civilians took their own lives. Entire families jumped from cliffs. Parents and children made unimaginable decisions driven by fear, wartime propaganda, and the belief that being captured by the enemy would be worse than death. For the United States, this was a terrifying preview. If a relatively small island had shown such extreme resistance, what would happen on Japan's main islands? What would unfold in densely populated cities like Tokyo? The estimates at the time were alarming. A full-scale invasion could result in millions of Japanese civilian deaths, along with massive casualties among soldiers on both sides. American losses alone could reach hundreds of thousands, or even more, depending on how fiercely Japan resisted. On the Japanese side, the strategy seemed clear: endure massive losses and prolong the war in hopes that the human cost would force the United States to reconsider continuing the conflict. This was a strategy based on exhaustion. And in the face of that reality, the United States found itself trapped in a brutal dilemma. Continuing the war through conventional means would likely lead to a long, devastating invasion. An alternative had to be considered. It is within this context that the decision to use the atomic bomb emerges. This new weapon represented a level of destruction never seen before. The expectation was that its impact would be so overwhelming that it would force Japan to surrender quickly, potentially avoiding a prolonged invasion and reducing the total number of deaths in the long run. But there was another layer to this decision: geopolitics. At that moment, the Soviet Union was rising as a massive military power. Its army was large, battle-hardened, and advancing across Europe with tremendous force. For the United States, ending the war wasn't only about defeating Japan, it was also about shaping the balance of power in the post-war world. The use of the atomic bomb, in this sense, also served as a clear demonstration of power. A direct message: the United States possessed a weapon capable of changing the rules of global conflict entirely. And so, in August 1945, the world witnessed something unprecedented. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck by atomic bombs, marking the beginning of the nuclear age. Even after the first attack, Japanese military leadership still resisted the idea of surrender. It took a second bombing, combined with direct intervention from the emperor, for the decision to finally end the war to be made. Even then, it is important to note, within the Japanese military, resistance continued until the very last moment. To this day, the decision to use the bombs remains surrounded by debate. Was it a necessary action to end the war quickly, or was it an act of disproportionate destruction? Perhaps there is no simple answer. What we do know is this: at that moment, every available option was deeply tragic. On one side, an invasion that could cost millions of lives. On the other, the use of a devastating weapon capable of immediate, massive destruction. And when faced with a choice like that, one question becomes unavoidable. If you were in that position, with the same information, under the same pressure, facing the same consequences, what would you have done? The goal here is not to justify, nor to condemn. It is to understand. Because in the end, war itself represents humanity's greatest failure. It is not fair, it is not clean, and it is certainly not beautiful. But once it begins, it is almost always driven to its conclusion as quickly as possible. Even if that ending comes through decisions that are difficult, controversial, and profoundly painful.